Good morning, everybody. My name is Lazaro Rodriguez, and I'm here to go over today's topics. So, the first question that we're asked is some researchers argue that racial stereotypes affect the ways in which decision makers, including criminal justice officials, evaluate the behavior of racial minorities. We're supposed to do an internet search on race-linked stereotypes, and what are some of the stereotypes associated with some of the minorities, and how might these affect judges and sentencing decisions? So, to begin with, stereotypes associated with race affects everyone, not just judges, but also police officers and just everyday normal life people. One of the biggest stereotypes that you see often in sentencing and policing in general, and with everyday people and just the way that they perceive others is, for example, for black African Americans, blacks with southern or hood-like accents are often thought of as uneducated, unsociable, troublemakers. Hispanics who don't speak English well or don't speak English, they're often thought of as lazy or cr- criminals because they seem people think that they're just feeding off the government, so they're most likely to commit crimes. The for Native Americans, often they're thought of as well as lazy complainers, and big stereotype of them is that they're considered to be big time drug users. And Asian Americans kind of get a little bit of different stereotype. They a negative stereotype in a way would be that they are considered nosy, but most importantly, I think people typically think that Asians are smart. So I'll talk a little bit about how that affects them later on. But um, I found a great article written by Dr. Kiernick in 2021, and it was just a study collected by a bunch of individuals. And what it talked about was just the role that different stereotypes had in by being perceived by people. So, for example, blacks who say stuff like going as opposed to going, or instead of saying things like he's all right, say something like he all right. Those type of perceived notions are thought of, those type of way of speaking that some individuals talk, they're thought of as them being less educated, and they're perceived as to be more prone to criminal behavior. um, and as far as for Asians, is in the other end of the spectrum, typically tend to get lighter sentences because they're perceived to be nicer people, and their crimes is usually considered to be a mistake. Second question talks about, it says under the Fair Sentencing Act 2010, disparity in amounts of crack and powder cocaine necessary to trigger a mandatory sentence of 5 or 10 years was reduced from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. Does this solve the problem of 18 to 1 disparity and still, or is this disparity still racially discriminatory? So essentially, what this was really good, because what that meant was that the sentencing for people who used crack cocaine before was essentially about 100 times worse than the sentence of people who had a crime similar to powder cocaine. Now, powder cocaine, crack cocaine, they're both from the same, right? Same type of cocaine, but they're just distributed differently. They're consumed differently, and they're typically found in different types of areas. So something like powder cocaine is viewed a little bit more as a high class kind of drug. So maybe more of a white collar kind of drug, as opposed to something like crack cocaine is viewed more as just a low the ground. You can find this maybe in like one of the hoods in your neighborhood, or impoverished area. So the reason why many people thought of this as being racially discriminatory is because the sentencings were so much higher for that of crack cocaine, obviously targeting those blacks and those minorities who are the ones who are the most users, while some lawyer, doctor, or someone with bigger stature, a politician who use powder cocaine, don't typically get the same sentence, even though they're the same drug. So the disparity is still there. Obviously, bringing it from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1 is a lot better, but in reality, it should be considered 1 to 1. The ACLU is a very good organization that are all for people's rights, and they wrote a great article, and I'll link it on if you're a little bit confused about it, and like how does the system actually work, and what do they mean by reducing these sentencing guidelines. And the third and final question says, in Gregg versus Georgia, Supreme Court assumed that racial discrimination would not be a problem under the guided discretion statutes enacted in the wake of Furman decision. Does this empirical evidence support or refute the assumption? So briefly, in Furman versus Georgia, Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional. Right in 1972, they said that, and for various reasons, different type of justices give their own opine on it. But essentially, some of the consensus is not necessarily that the death penalty itself is cruel, but in the way that it's given, that can be arbitrary, random, without really any barriers, any justified means to it. So there's no set. It's not like, okay, you kill a person, therefore everybody who kills a person is gonna have the death penalty. Typically, there's more things that deal into it, where it's like the severity of the crime, how many people kill how many people were killed in that crime. So there's a lot of different factors that go into who gets the death penalty. But the Supreme Court thought that still it's a very opinionated type of sentencing. I mean, I guess all of them are, but in a way, this sentence is worse to be, well, it is worse to be given because it's a death penalty, and it shouldn't be based off more like opinions, if that makes sense. So then, fast forward a few years later, 4 years later, in Gregg versus Georgia, Troy Gregg, he got convicted of killing a person, and it was a little bit more to that, but he was given the death penalty. He appealed, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld the decision to maintain the death penalty, and essentially what they said was like, look, listen, this is not violating your Eighth Amendment rights because you received 2 trials, and one of them was for sentencing, one's for your actual verdict of guilt or not guilty. So you received a fair trial. This has nothing to do with you being black. You just committed a murder, and you deserve this punishment. So what the question really is asking us today is, when the decisions were made at the time, they thought this has nothing to do with race. But as we know now down the line, 100% a lot has to do with race. Since 1970, I have it pulled up here, another great article from the ACLU. Since 1976, 43% of all executions that have been carried out in the United States from the death penalty have been blacks, right? And you might think to yourself, well, they're just black, right? Blacks are criminal, right? Isn't that what that means? No, it's not what that means, because only 14%, a little bit less than 14% of the population in the United States make up are black. So the numbers just don't match up. It's not that the blacks are committing crimes more often, or disproportionately more often than excuse me, it was a bug in my eyes, than whites, because the population is not there. So that's not the case. Another, in my opinion, the biggest important factor in here says, since October 2022, 12 people have been executed where the defendant was white and the murder victim was black, as opposed to 178 where it was the opposite. So it is very much with fact that we see that whenever a black person gets killed by a white person, the death penalty is not handed down to them. And whenever a black person kills a white person, 178 times they have been executed for it. So all this means is, of course, is nuances and different facts of every single case, and not every case is the same. And I know it's hard to say, yes, did this person accept the death penalty or not, but the numbers speak for themselves, right? You cannot have this huge quantity, this big disparity in who gets the death penalty and who actually gets executed when it comes to race, and then think, oh, well, that's just how it is. The numbers just don't really match up. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope everybody has a good day.